Phone buzzed against the kitchen counter at 11:47 p.m., and I already knew before I looked at the screen that it was going to be one of those calls. My mother's neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, doesn't call late unless something is wrong. "David," she said, breathless, "your mom fell in the bathroom." I heard the crash through the wall. "Paramedics are here now." I was already grabbing my keys when my wife, Renee, rolled over in bed and asked, without opening her eyes, whether it was serious. I told her I didn't know yet, that I had to go. She said, "Okay," and went back to sleep. That was the first small crack. I didn't notice it that night. I was too busy driving 40 minutes in the dark, running red lights I shouldn't have run, praying my mother hadn't broken her hip. She had. 82 years old, a fractured hip, 3 days in the hospital, then 6 weeks in a rehab facility that smelled like bleach and boiled chicken. When she came home, she couldn't walk without a walker, couldn't shower without help, couldn't cook, couldn't drive. She needed someone. And I made the mistake of assuming that someone would be both of us, because that's what marriage means, or what I thought it meant. I sat Renee down at our dining table on a Tuesday evening and laid it out plainly. My mother needed help for the next few months, maybe longer. I couldn't do it alone and hold down my job managing the warehouse. I asked if she could pick up groceries twice a week, sit with her a few afternoons, help with the physical therapy exercises the doctor had shown us. Renee looked at me across the table, set down her fork, and said the sentence that has replayed in my head every day since. "That's not my mother, David. Figure it out yourself." I want to be fair here, because I've turned this over in my mind 100 times looking for the version where she wasn't as cold as she sounded. Renee had never been close to my mother. There was history there, small frictions over the years, comments about how I was raised, opinions about our wedding that my mother never quite kept to herself. I understood there was no great love between them, but I had never once, in 9 years of marriage, refused to help her mother when her father was dying of cancer. I took 2 weeks of unpaid leave. I drove her mother to appointments. I sat in waiting rooms I had no business sitting in, holding a stranger's hand because my wife needed me to. I never once said figure it out yourself. So when she said it to me, so easily, so flatly, like she was declining a chore rather than a person's dignity, something in me went very quiet. Not angry yet, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes right before you finally see someone clearly for the first time. I didn't argue that night. I nodded, cleared the table, and went to bed early. But I lay there awake until almost 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, running the arithmetic of my marriage. 9 years. No children, by choice, mostly hers. A house we'd bought together. A woman I had built an entire life around, who could look me in the eye while my mother lay in a hospital bed 40 minutes away and tell me to figure it out myself, as if I were asking her to solve a math problem instead of asking her to be a decent person for a few hours a week. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, lying there in the dark, I made a decision. I didn't announce it. I didn't argue for it. I simply decided, and the next morning, I began. I called my mother's rehab coordinator first thing and asked what the transition home plan looked like, what equipment we'd need, what a part-time home aide would cost. Then I called my manager and asked about shifting to 4 10-hour days instead of 5 8-hour days, which he approved without much fuss since I'd never once asked for anything like it in 6 years. Then I called a contractor about converting our downstairs office into a bedroom with a walk-in shower, because my mother's house had stairs she'd never manage again, and because some part of me already knew what I was building toward. Renee walked past the office doorway that evening while I was measuring the space with a tape measure, and she asked what I was doing. I told her the truth. I said I was making room for my mother to move in with us during her recovery. She laughed. Not cruelly. Not yet. More like she assumed I was joking. When she realized I wasn't, the laugh disappeared fast. "You're not serious," she said. I told her I was completely serious, that my mother had nobody else, and that I wasn't willing to warehouse her in some facility so my wife wouldn't have to be inconvenienced for a season of her life. Renee's face did something I hadn't seen before. Not sadness, calculation. She tried a different approach after that, softer, almost reasonable sounding. She said she just didn't think it was fair that she'd have to reorganize her whole life around a woman who'd never liked her, that it wasn't personal, that surely there were paid services for exactly this situation, that we could afford a proper aid if it came to that. On its own, that argument might have held some water. I even considered it seriously for a day, called 2 home care agencies, got quotes that made my stomach turn, $3,000 a month for anything approaching full coverage. Money we technically had, but that Renee had always guarded like it belonged to some future version of us. She was still deciding whether to build. When I mentioned the cost to her, hoping maybe the number would soften her into offering even a little of her own time instead, she said, without missing a beat, that it was still cheaper than a divorce, and laughed like she'd made a joke. I didn't laugh. That was the moment I understood this wasn't really about logistics for her. It was about not wanting her comfort disturbed, not wanting her routine touched, not wanting to give one single afternoon of her time to a woman who needed it. And underneath all of it was a colder truth I hadn't let myself look at directly until that moment. My wife had drawn an invisible line around herself years ago, and everyone outside that line, including, apparently, my own mother, existed purely on her terms. I had spent 9 years standing just inside that line, mistaking the privilege of being let in for love. I started noticing other things once I started looking, the way you notice a crack in a windshield spreading once you finally admit it's there. The way Renee referred to my mother as your mom, instead of by name, even after 9 years, as if keeping the label formal kept the relationship formal too. The way she'd excuse herself from every holiday phone call, every birthday, every small, ordinary gesture of family, always with a reason that sounded fine on its own, but added up to something else entirely when you stacked 9 years of them together. I hadn't stacked them until that week. I hadn't wanted to. The following day is the one that changed everything, though it didn't look dramatic from the outside. I drove to the rehab facility that morning to pick my mother up early, before her official discharge time, because I couldn't stand the thought of her sitting there one more hour longer than she had to. While I was signing paperwork at the front desk, my mother's physical therapist, a kind woman named Priya, who'd clearly grown fond of her over 6 weeks, pulled me aside. She told me something my mother hadn't mentioned, maybe out of pride, maybe because she didn't want to be a burden even in the telling of it. She said my mother had asked, more than once during her stay, whether Renee had called, whether Renee was coming to visit. Priya said my mother would light up a little each time the phone rang, and then quietly deflate when it wasn't her. Not one single call in 6 weeks. Not one. I had visited every day I could, but I hadn't thought to check whether my wife had reached out on her own, because it had genuinely never crossed my mind that she wouldn't, not even once, not even a 2-minute call to ask how she was healing. I stood in that hallway with the discharge papers in my hand and felt something settle in me, cold and complete, like a door closing somewhere I couldn't see. I brought my mother home that afternoon, set her up in the downstairs room the contractor had already started converting, made her tea, and sat with her while she cried, quietly, out of relief more than pain, because for the first time in 6 weeks, she wasn't in a room full of strangers. Renee came home from work at 6 and stood in the doorway of what used to be her home office, looking at my mother's suitcase, at the hospital bed rail I'd rented, at the whole visible fact of a decision she thought she'd talked me out of. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She looked at me and said, very evenly, "If she's staying, I'm not." I told her that was her choice to make, and that I respected it, and that I hoped she'd think carefully before making it permanent. She left that night with a bag packed for her sister's house, certain, I think, that I would call within a few days begging her to come back, that the reality of caregiving would humble me fast. It didn't happen the way she expected. The weeks that followed were hard, genuinely hard, sleepless in ways I hadn't experienced since I was a child. But they were also, in a way I hadn't anticipated, some of the fullest weeks of my adult life. I learned my mother's stories again, the ones I'd half heard 100 times as a boy and never really listened to. I learned she'd wanted to be a nurse before she had me and my sister, that she'd given it up not out of duty, but because she genuinely loved being home with us more than she'd loved the idea of a career, that she still remembered the exact color of the dress she wore to meet my father the first time. I learned how to help her in and out of a shower chair without either of us feeling humiliated by it. I learned that caregiving, the actual unglamorous daily work of it, teaches you something about love that convenience never will, because love that only shows up when it's easy was never really love, just good weather. Renee called 3 weeks in, casual at first, asking how things were, testing the water. I told her the truth, that my mother was healing well, that I was managing, that I didn't need rescuing from a decision she'd been so certain would break me. The calls kept coming, softer each time, then not so casual anymore, then finally direct. She wanted to come home. She said she'd had time to think, that maybe she'd overreacted, that family should come first even when it's difficult. I let a long silence sit on the line before I answered her, because I needed her to hear the weight of it. I told her I loved the person I thought she was for 9 years, but that the night she told me to figure it out myself, and the 6 weeks of silence that followed it, showed me who she actually was underneath that person, and I wasn't willing to unsee it just because it had become inconvenient for her to be seen. I told her I wasn't angry anymore, not really, just certain, in a way I'd never let myself be certain before, about what kind of home I wanted to build and who deserved to be inside it. My mother is still with us. She's walking with a cane now instead of a walker, cooking again on the days her hip doesn't ache too badly, teasing me about how long it took me to learn to fold a fitted sheet properly. Some evenings she falls asleep in the recliner in front of the television before 8 o'clock, and I sit there a while longer just watching her chest rise and fall, grateful in a way I don't think I could have understood before all of this, that I get to witness these small, unremarkable, ordinary moments of her still being here. Renee and I are divorced, quietly, without much drama in the end, because there wasn't much left to fight over once the truth of that one sentence had finished doing its work. People ask me sometimes if I regret how fast everything moved, whether I should have tried harder to bridge the gap, whether 9 years deserved a longer goodbye. I tell them the truth, which is that the goodbye had actually been building for years. I just hadn't had a sentence sharp enough to notice it until she handed me one herself. Figure it out yourself. I did. I'm still figuring it out, every single day, and it turns out the answer was simpler than I expected. You take care of the people who showed up